Hello, this is a lecture on Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. I realize that this text is relatively easy to read. I did see a few things that I wanted to point out that had not come up in the discussions, and a few things that I wanted to kind of comment on that were in the discussions as well. There were some comments that seemed to suggest, these might have been in the Three Things papers, I'm not really sure, but that seemed to suggest that that Jacobs should have been writing about women in general instead of about black women, and I think that's it's difficult to kind of see where that would make a lot of sense. Her point in writing this is to make a case for support for abolition, to get rid of slavery. She was trying to make the argument that slavery was a difficult thing, and trying to give a woman's perspective, and trying to make the argument to women in the North who were, potentially sympathetic to the plight of women slaves. And so a lot of the decisions that she makes in this text are made around the idea that she's trying to persuade women who don't have experience with slavery, haven't seen it up close, by telling them her story as sort of an eyewitness account of, or one woman's experience with slavery, so that those women will be able to generate some sympathy based on their own position as women. So the text is not about sort of the plight of women in general in the 19th century. The text is about slavery. And so I think a few of you missed that point, or seem to judge her for not being more inclusive. And that's not really what she's intending. She's writing a text that had a very specific content for that time, and it had a very specific argument, and while you can say it should have been something different, that's like saying an apple should be an orange. I mean, it is what it is, and it's that for a very specific, and I would argue a very good reason. The text was written by Jacobs after she was freed, or escaped to freedom, actually. And it was edited by the abolitionist and feminist Lydia Maria Child, who Jacobs had met, and Child urged her to publish her text, and then served as a general editor for the text, went through and modified a little bit of it, as she says in her introduction. And she also helped Jacobs to find an author. One of the ways that slave narratives were routinely discounted or argued against, although I should point out that they were extremely persuasive, and seemed to have a huge effect. I mean, they got people thinking and talking about slavery who didn't have experience with it. But one of the charges often leveled against slave texts was that they couldn't possibly have been written by slaves, and that they must have been fakes written by abolitionists who were white. And so there's been work done to prove definitively that Jacobs is in fact the author, and there's a strong support of that she in fact is the writer of the text. So that's something that, right from the get-go, there was some effort to discredit not only her text, but other texts as well of this time. So I think that's important for you guys to understand. The tactic that she's using to try to persuade these women is a kind of a dual tactic of using pathos, i.e. an emotional appeal, as well as an ethical appeal or an ethos appeal, based on the idea that she's trying to persuade these women that, how would you feel if you were in my place? And so she's trying to elicit empathy from them about the things that she had to go through. And so that's why there's such an emphasis on the position of women here, is her audience is women, so it makes perfect sense that the arguments that she would make would appeal to the place where 19th century women typically were, which were wives and mothers, trying to hang on to their virginity as long as they possibly could, trying to stay chaste and behave themselves, etc., etc. You can see where a lot of the choices that she makes in the text are around things that would definitely appeal to sort of ordinary middle-class white women. She makes the arguments then about slave women, describing for her audience some of the things that she witnessed as well as experienced. Obviously, one of those things is sexual brutality, the idea that essentially Dr. Flint is sexually harassing her from about the time she's 14 or 15 years old, whispering things in her ear, making unwanted advances toward her. He never actually acts on any of these things because he has some sense of a reputation to uphold, but he wants her to come, and he also wants her to come to him willingly. He does not want to to rape her. He wants to make her his mistress and make her want to be there, which in some ways is more, maybe not more violent, but as violent, and it's certainly as pernicious and difficult. Maybe in some ways it's crueler even, because it has this sort of sense of an ongoing torment. There's the issue of miscegenation, or the mixing of races, which was a huge issue, of course, in the 19th century. It's clear, she makes abundantly clear throughout her text, that there are numerous mulatto children running around. That's the term for, of course, for children who are biracial is the term we would use now. She herself has white blood. Both of her parents are mulatto, or her grandmother's a mulatto. I forget now exactly what the family relationships are, but there is a substantial amount of white blood running through her veins as it is. This, of course, is a major topic. The idea that mulatto children, the children of slave owners, and their own legitimate children playing together but not really not being treated as brother and sister, being treated with this great inequity, is something that she puts a lot of emphasis on. It was one of those things that really riled up white women in the South as well as in the North. And so this is a point that she's trying to get across, because she knew that it was something that would be persuasive. Other things that she brings up here is the idea of the illegitimacy of black marriages. She doesn't quite go to that, but the idea was that black people really didn't have the right to marry legally because they were property. And so if they did choose to marry, they were allowed to stay together only so long as the slave owners allowed it. If they thought it was better for them to be married and there was an advantage to that, then it was fine. If there was some reason to separate a family, they would certainly do it. And so the idea too that your master had the right to say who you could marry and who you could not marry, of course, is a big piece of this as well, because she tells us her story about the man she's in love with, who's a free black man who would certainly buy her, but Dr. Flint always uses that manipulation of, I can't sell you because you belong to my daughter, which is completely bull, by the way. He would have probably been happy to sell slaves that belonged to any of his children at any time. But he uses it as a way to keep her around and to kind of keep control over her. That's a huge part of this text, is the idea of how his interaction with her is about controlling her, and the fact that she is spirited probably made it more appealing to him to sort of break her down. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind here as well. There's a lot of abuse in that idea, and a lot of emotional abuse, which is surprising in some ways, because it makes the text more complex than being simply about a master-slave kind of relationship in the sort of simplified way we tend to think of it. I mean, there's obviously a complicated relationship here, and while she despises this guy, she's dependent on him, and she has to put up with a certain degree of this stuff. So it's a really interesting and intricate relationship. And then finally, of course, the families could be broken up at will. It was very common for owners to sell away children. Once children became useful, if they were, it was more useful to sell the child away and make the money off of them rather than using them on the plantation or on the property. That was, of course, a common issue, and so that's something else that she points out in the idea of being separated from your own biological child against your will, is something that she no doubt recognized that white northern women would feel very strongly. And then finally, I want you to think about, kind of in relationship to your paper that's due this week, the idea of identity. Who does she identify with? How does she see herself? She clearly sees herself as a woman. She sees herself as a mother. Although we don't see as much of that in the text that we have in our book, there's quite a bit more in the longer text. It's a relatively long autobiographical memoir kind of text. She sees herself as she sees herself as a slave. She sees herself as part of her family of origin. She sees herself as part of the slave family to some degree. So there's all these different groups that she belongs to, and she obviously puts a huge emphasis on women because that's her point that she wants to make, but this text could be read from other perspectives as well, and you could look at how she sees herself in the context of these other relationships as well. Okay, that's the end of this lecture. Just a few things, as I said, that I wanted to point out. I'll be back with a lecture on Alice Walker as soon as I can.